Thank you, appreciate that. Okay, so today I want to read from, to begin with, Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. I always point out when we read from Hebrews that technically speaking, we don't really know who the author is for the reason that the author does not identify himself. In the early church fathers attributed it to Paul, and there's lots of reasons why that would be the case. People, scholars argue about these things. Nevertheless, it's very authoritative, and the writer is obviously knowledgeable and points out things. I tend to think as I read this letter to the Hebrews, even if it's not Paul, even if it's not somebody we've heard of, it really doesn't matter, because the author of the Hebrews is not claiming any kind of special revelation. He's not claiming any special insight other than just logic, the logic of the basic facts of the matter. For instance, here in chapter 10, we read this. For the law, in verse 1, for the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never, with those sacrifices which they offered year by year, continually make the comers thereunto perfect. Now, just so you understand what he said there, for a Jewish person, and by the way, that's why this is called Hebrews, because he is speaking specifically, as you read it in the context, to Jewish Christians, and he's making the argument that Jesus is the fulfillment of what was foretold in the Old Testament, both directly through prophecy and also indirectly through the symbols of the things that were required under the Old Testament. In fact, here he explicitly says that the law, meaning the things that were required under the law, were not in and of themselves the reality of what God wanted. They were merely a shadow of good things to come. In other words, a reflection or a shadow of something that was coming but now has come. And they are not the very reality of the things. And his argument here is that the sacrifices which were required under the law, and the animal sacrifices, he says, they offered them year by year. In other words, they kept on going. Every year they kept offering the same sacrifices. And he says continually. In other words, it was a continuous action. And it said, but it could not make the people who were the recipients of that, the worshipers, in other words, could not finish the job or do the job, could not make them perfect. And then he says in verse 2, and again, we see his logic here, for then would they not have ceased to be offered. Now that's a good point. In other words, those sacrifices of those animals that were required under the law didn't actually do the job, because, he says, they would not be offered anymore if they did the job. That's the argument. Would they not have ceased to be offered? And here's why, he says. Because the worshipers, listen, once purged, the worshipers once purged should have had no more conscience of sins. In other words, and what he's going to go on and argue explicitly in a moment, though let's go on reading. Verse 3, but in those sacrifices, that is to say, those that were required under the law, the animal sacrifices, the shedding of blood of animals, but in those sacrifices there's a remembrance again made of sins every year. So he said, not only could they not take away sins, but in fact they brought them to remembrance because they were offered again. Verse 4 says, for it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. Now what he's going to say, and we're not going to go on reading any further, but what he's going to say is that, of course, you get the point, and it's implied here, and it makes it explicit as you go on reading. When Jesus came, that which was foreshadowed by those animal sacrifices that could never do the job, when Jesus came, he did the job of taking away sins. But go back to verse 2 for a moment. I just want to draw your attention to something it says here. He said that the blood of those animals could not take away sins, and they were offered year by year, and they couldn't really make the people, the worshipers, perfect, as he says, or complete. It couldn't really do the job. In verse 2, he says, for then would they not have ceased to be offered. Now get this, because the worshipers once purged, should have had no more conscience of sins. Now, a week or so ago, we read from the beginning of Hebrews that Jesus, in chapter 1, it says that after he had by himself purged our sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. And here he's saying that if the worshipers, even though the animals did not do it, and it's possible that they could, but the point is that the worshipers, once purged, listen to this, should have had no more conscience of sins. Now, the word conscience here is an interesting word. Let me explain it to you. Now, by the way, let me just remind everybody, I'm not a Greek scholar, but I can read what the Greek scholars tell us. The word that's translated here, conscience, is a Greek word, and it is pronounced suneidesis. Suneidesis. And it means the consciousness of anything, to be conscious of something. It's a compound word made up of two Greek words, sun, which means with, and eidesis, which means to know or to be aware. So literally, these two words put together, a word meaning with and a word meaning to be aware or to know, it means a shared awareness. A shared awareness. So that what that should make you think is, shared with who? Well, in ancient Greek philosophy, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle used this word in their writings. And when they wrote about it, this word, suneidesis, which is translated consciousness, they spoke about it in terms of self-awareness or an internal recognition of what is right or wrong. That is, in other words, a moral compass. And that's how you could understand it. But I like this word, shared awareness, meaning a shared consciousness between the self and a higher moral order, or God, or divine presence. That's the way the Greeks thought of it, a consciousness shared with the self in a higher moral order. In other words, there's me, but then there's a perfect moral order, and my conscience is that which is a shared awareness. Now, for us as Christians, we understand that the shared awareness, the perfect moral order, is God Himself. And we could say the conscience means a shared awareness with God. Now, let me say this. What that then means is we need to understand what is in the mind of God if we're going to have a shared awareness about this. Now, what he said here, that's what conscious means, to be conscious of or to be aware of. And if it's a shared awareness that's being spoken of, God sees everything correctly and appropriately, but we may not understand what's in the mind of God, and we should. And what he's saying here is, specifically, the sacrifice of Jesus is the perfect sacrifice and purged us of sins, and so the worshipers, once purged, should have no more awareness of sins. Now, that's how God sees it. But if we don't understand that that's how God sees it, or if we see our conscience can be made aware, can be educated. Now, the problem, as I see it, is that as Christians, we are bombarded with different views of the reality of our relationship with God. And our knowledge of God is filtered through who we listen to and what we listen to and where we receive our understanding of Christianity. And if you don't understand what he just said here, if we don't see it this way, you see, let me put it this way. When Jesus went to the cross and sacrificed himself and shed his blood to purge us from sins and to take away sins, those are both expressions that are used in this passage, to take away or to purge us from our sins. God understood perfectly. And in the mind of God, sin is already purged. Your sin is already purged or taken away. And it's done whether you know about it or not in the mind of God. But if you don't know it, you're going to labor under false impressions or misimpressions. For instance, I'll give an example. When we started off as Christians, we didn't really know much except what we had heard through, you might say, through osmosis, through being in church. And I can't speak for April, but I can speak for myself. And I had the impression that being a Christian was a very tenuous thing, and you might fail at any moment, and you might lose it. And it was like walking on a tightrope, and one false step, and maybe you're a goner. Or to say it another way, and I've said this before, as though you had been admitted to an exclusive club, and you were on probation, and only if you dotted your I's and crossed your T's and proved yourself worthy to be in this exclusive club could you stay. And if you made too many mistakes, you might get kicked out the back door, and you might get removed. Or to say it yet another way, many Christians have the understanding that when you become a Christian, when you believe in Jesus, God gives you a second chance. Now see if you can do any better. And the sad fact of the matter, which most people don't want to admit, and say out loud, is the reality is everybody needs more than a second chance. And it's not chance anyway. It's something better than chance. Now, what I wanted to attract your attention to here is that this writer to the Hebrews puts a great emphasis on the worshipers, and that's us, being once purged and having no more consciousness of sins or no more awareness, because God doesn't have any more awareness of it. As far as God's concerned, the sacrifice of Jesus was sufficient and satisfactory. And we, having entered into it, should view it in exactly that same way. Now, in this book of Hebrews, he's got a lot to say about this subject. And another place that he mentions it is in chapter 9. So just bear with me and we'll bring this into focus here. In chapter 9, Torin, and we're going to go back to chapter 9 and start with verse, let's start with verse 11. It's hard to find a good place to start here. One reason why I think this might actually be written by Paul is because every verse starts with a preposition. It's connected to the one that comes before, and that's just how Paul writes in one long run-on sentence. So in verse 11 it says, "But Christ being come," this is chapter 9, verse 11, "But Christ being come a high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands," that is to say, not of this building. He means not a physical temple. He's not a physical priest, not a physical temple. Verse 12 says, "Neither by the blood of by the blood of calves, goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place." Listen, "having obtained eternal redemption for us." Now that's a really important expression here, so let me dwell on it just a minute. And I can feel that the heater came back on, so April, can you turn the thermostat so that make the heat go off? Oh, it's an aspect. Okay, well, I'll endure it. You see, I'm up here about how am I, about a foot higher than everybody else, so I'm up here in the heat. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we'll edit this out so the viewing audience won't have to. Anyway, okay. He said that Jesus. You know what we read about in chapter 10? He was contrasting the Old Testament with the New Testament. He was contrasting the offerings that were offered in the temple, the animal offerings. And he said that those didn't really do anything. They didn't really produce anything, because if they did, you wouldn't have to offer it again and again and again. It didn't have to be repeated. What he's implying is anything that has to be repeated again and again and again doesn't get the job done. Just ponder that for a moment. Something that has to be repeated again and again and again doesn't get the job done. In other words, it's not eternal. It's not fixed forever. Now, in the Old Testament, they offered animals again and again and again, and all it really served to do was be a remembrance of the fact that it's not done, because you have to repeat it again and again and again. And I think that in the mind of many Christians, that's the situation. I think that's the misunderstanding that is in the mind of many Christians. And by the way, they got it through what they heard, or in church, perhaps. You see, we shouldn't go to church and hear about sin. I'll just say that. We're not supposed to go to church and hear about sin. We're supposed to go to church and hear about the remedy for sin and how sin was put away. And the object is to remove the consciousness of sins, to remove awareness of sins. It shouldn't be anything that you ever think about. Now, instead, what's in the mind of many Christians is, I heard one person actually verbalize it, put it this way. Well, when you become a Christian, God erases all your sins up until that point. But then, it's kind of like if you had a board, and every time you committed a sin or did something wrong, it was like hammering a nail in that board. And then when you become a Christian, God pulls out the nails and gives you the board back. And it's like, go see if you can do better now. So now you got a board full of holes, which are a constant reminder. And then every time you do something wrong, well, now you're in jeopardy again and depending on what branch of Christianity you are raised in, if you're a Catholic, then until you go back to church and hear the Mass again, and then that pulls the nail out, and now you're back in good standing again. Or if you're a modern day evangelical or charismatic, we put all the emphasis on the confession of sins. If you confess your sins, then God pulls the nail out and gives you the board back. Now you're in good standing again. Now, in both of those, the misunderstanding is that some action on your part removes sin. What you should say instead is, the action of Jesus, once for all, forever purged my sins. And sin is taken away and purged because of his action once for all. Notice this in verse 12. It said he, with his blood, with his sacrifice, entered into the holy place once, it says. Not over and over again, but once. And then it says, having obtained eternal redemption for us. Now there's three important words I want to draw to your attention in that little expression. The first one is obtained. And again, I'm going to give you the Greek word. The Greek word is horisko, and it means to procure. He has obtained or procured eternal redemption. Eternal is the word aionios, meaning without end or never to cease. And redemption is a word lutrosis. It means to liberate, to release, or to set free by the payment of a ransom. In classical Greek literature like Herodotus or Thucydides, this word that's translated here, redemption, was a word that was used to describe a sum paid to liberate prisoners of war, for instance, in Herodotus. Or in legal or financial terms, it was used to describe the cancellation of a debt or the fulfillment of a legal obligation. So in other words, Jesus has procured by his sacrifice a never-ending or never-to-cease cancellation of a debt and the complete fulfillment of a legal obligation. So just so you get a good clear picture of this, I looked this up in several different translations. And let's just see how this expression that Jesus obtained eternal redemption for us, let's just see how other translations handle it. Here is the Amplified. He secured complete redemption and everlasting release for us. The Living Bible says, He made sure our eternal redemption. The Message says, He set us free once and for all. The New Century Translation says, He set us free from sin forever. Phillips says, He won for us eternal reconciliation with God. I like that one. Eternal, that means it lasts forever. That means there's no end to it. That means it never ceases. Now let me point out three important things here. Number one, Jesus did it, not you. Isn't that what it says? We're talking about something He did. Jesus did it, not you. And by the way, since He did it, are you ready for this? Since He did it, you can't undo it. Jesus did it, not you. Number two, what did He do? What He did was He set us free from the penalty of sin. He canceled the debt, freeing us from that obligation. He did it. And number three, what He did in that setting us free from the penalty for sin and the cancellation of the debt, what He did was eternal, fixed, and secure. It can't be undone because He did it. Now, here's a question that arises in some people's minds. I know because sometimes people approach me and ask about this. This is a secret fear in the minds of many Christians. And I don't want it to be a secret fear, so I'm just going to talk about it. The secret fear is that maybe I've done too many bad things. What if I do something bad? What if I do something really bad? I've mentioned this before, but I used to go to these men's meetings called Promise Keepers, and it's men from different denominations, from different churches, from different church backgrounds. And we all get together and talk, and well, you know, there were some positive things. I say I shouldn't be so frank as to say it was mostly unprofitable, but that was my impression. That was how I felt about it. Because everybody brought their baggage. Everybody brought their religious baggage with them. And it ended up devolving into an argument based on nonsensical, efforts to prove things based on, well, here's how I was always taught, and this is what I think. And, sort of a... Like I heard one person, who said this? One person said, most people's minds are just like concrete, thoroughly mixed and well set. And that's sort of what it was. A bunch of concrete blocks bumping into one another. But anyway, after one of these little episodes, walking out of the church, and we would go to different churches and meet, I was walking down the steps next to a man, and he just blurted out of the blue. He wasn't talking to me. I don't know. Maybe he was, but he didn't look at me. He didn't address me. We were just walking side by side. And just out of the blue, like he just into the air, he says, well, I know we've all got to pay for what we've done. Well, okay. What do you want me to say to that? I disagree. And I think Hebrews here, and then throughout the New Testament, I mean, this isn't the only passage. No, we don't pay for what we've done. Jesus paid for what we've done. And not only that, it's eternal and fixed and secure and certain. And not only that, He wants you to know. If you don't know, you walk through life afraid and insecure and certain. Now, the good news is God knows whether you know it or not. The bad news is if you don't know it, then you are in a state of insecurity and fear, and you live your life afraid. Afraid of God, afraid you're going to have to pay for what you've done. Here, the passages we've read say that by the sacrifice of Himself, by the shedding of His blood, Jesus has obtained eternal redemption for us, and we, once purged or cleansed by that sacrifice, should not have any more conscience of it. Now, you remember the word consciousness means a shared awareness. Our awareness should be shared with the awareness of God. God's aware. See, He knows what the sacrifice of Jesus did, whether you know it or not. And listen to this. He recognizes that whether you believe it or not. It's true whether you know it or not. It's true whether you believe it or not. But if you believe it, you get to enjoy the benefits of it. And as Christians, we should believe that. And that should be the thing we're standing on, what Jesus did for us. Now let me give you a few examples. Does God reject anyone? Does God ever turn anyone away? No. No. The answer is no. Especially in the light of what we've just been reading. But let's read something that I think is a really good illustration of this. This is in John's Gospel in chapter 6. This is John's Gospel, chapter 6, and I'm going to start reading, I think, with, let's just start with verse 1. It's such a great story. We may not have time to read the whole thing, but verse 1, John chapter 6, verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Verse 2 says, and a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles, which he did on them that were diseased. Verse 3 says, and Jesus went up to a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw the great company coming to him, he said unto Philip, whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Verse 7, Philip answered and said, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them might take a little. In other words, are you kidding me? That's what he's saying. Are you kidding me? We don't have the money, this amount here. That doesn't mean anything to us, 300 pennyworth. I guarantee that doesn't mean anything to anybody today. But that's what he's just saying. We don't have the money to feed this big crowd here. Verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said unto him, there is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? In other words, we got this, we can't buy them all this food, but we have this boy here. He has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. And every time I read this, it reminds me of, I actually did read this once. It says he has 5, and you know what's going to happen is Jesus is going to bless the food and feed the multitude. I read a commentator that said, well, they had bigger loaves of bread in those days. But not so big that little boy is carrying. I picture when I read that, I picture in my mind this little boy carrying these, sides of a semi-truck. These big. I've got these 5 barley loaves, and I can barely lift them. But anyway, Jesus said, "Make the men sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down. The number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that sat down, and likewise the fishes as much as they would. And when they were filled, he said to his disciples, get this, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Now, just let that little comment sink in. See, Jesus, could I say this? Jesus staged this event. I mean, he did this on purpose. He didn't have to do this. He could have sent them away. He could have said, all right, thank you for coming. 5,000 people, thank you for coming. Everybody go home now, and we'll see you again next Sunday. I mean, he could have sent them away, but he did this on purpose. And then having miraculously fed them, he makes this little comment. I think it's a telling comment. Here in the King James it says, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. I want to read you Young's literal translation. There is a concordance called Young's Concordance, and he made a literal translation. Here's the Young's literal translation. Gather together the broken pieces, that nothing may be lost. To me, what I see here is that not that Jesus just didn't want to be messy, not that he didn't want to be a litter bug, and not that he didn't want to not that he wanted to gather up because they're going to get 12 baskets full of fragments. It's not because he wanted to show off and say, look how great I am. Look at this great miracle. He's making a point here. He's showing you the heart of God. You see, he's going to spiritualize this whole thing in the next few verses. When they come around the next day and want to have another meal, he's going to make a spiritual point. And ultimately in this chapter, he's going to say, I am the bread. Because the people who came to him, they said, well, you know, Moses gave them manna in the wilderness. And in other words, they're trying to say, Jesus, we're going to follow you around. You're just going to make magic bread for us every day, so we don't have to go to the store anymore. And they said, well, you know, Moses gave us manna from heaven. And Jesus said, no, Moses did not give you manna from heaven. God gave you that. God sent down the bread from heaven. Then he said, I'm the bread. I'm the bread that came down from. I am the bread that came down from heaven. See, he's making a spiritual lesson out of all of this. And I think when he says here, gather the broken pieces that nothing be lost, I can't help but read that and say to myself, you could, if you wanted to, say that he's looking at the lives of humans. You know, he knows what he's all about. He knows he's going to go to the cross and shed his blood, make a sacrifice, and purge us once for all forever. That's because we are, you could say, we are like the broken pieces. In other words, the broken lives of humans, he's going to fix those. And his attitude is that none be lost. That's what he says. Now, I don't think there's anything, I don't see anything really wrong with thinking that God's got that much of a charitable attitude. I'm charitable enough to say, I think he thinks of the whole world that way. But at least let's agree that he thinks of the Christians this way, that none be lost. I think that's fair enough to say. Now, let's skip ahead and to verse 26. The next day they came and found him. And he said, verily, verily, in verse 26, I say unto you, you seek me not because you saw the miracles, but because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. Verse 27, labor not, he says, for the meat which perisheth. In other words, that's temporal. But that meat which endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you. Now notice the word everlasting. That's like the word eternal that we read in Hebrews when he said that he obtained eternal redemption for us. Now read this again. Labor not for the meat which perisheth. See, what he's saying is physical things are temporal. The physical world is temporary. Everything that's physical is temporal. Everything that you do in the physical world is temporal. Your bodies are temporary. Do we understand that? Everything you see in this physical world is temporary. But there are things that are eternal. That which is not seen is eternal. And he says, don't be so concerned about what's temporary. What's more important is what's eternal. And he says, and that's something that me, the Son of Man, will give to you. I'm going to give it to you. In other words, to use the language of Hebrews, I'm going to go procure for you something eternal, and I'm going to give it to you. Everything else is temporal. Everything else is temporary. And by the way, all of those sacrifices that were contrasted in the book of Hebrews and everything done under the Old Testament was physical and temporal. But Jesus came to replace what was physical and temporal with what was spiritual and eternal and fixed. See, eternal means it can't be changed. You can't undo it. Which the Son of Man shall give unto you. For him hath the Father sealed. Now here they ask a question in verse 28, which says, in the King James translation, their question is, what shall we do then, that we may work the works of God? The Amplified, Torrin, could you put up the Amplified translation? What are we to do that we may habitually be working the works of God? What are we to do to carry out what God requires? And just to clarify here, they're saying, what is it you want from us? What does God want from us then? I think in their minds is, we don't really know what you're talking about, but so tell us what's the requirement, you know? what are we supposed to do? What's our part? So Torrin, now go back to King James. We don't need the Amplified for the next verse. Jesus answered and said to them, this is the work of God. In other words, this is what God requires. This is the work of God, that you believe on him whom he hath sent. He's saying, just to make it simple for you, just to make it clear for you, all he wants from you is to place your trust in, or to believe in, or to place your confidence in the one he sent, Jesus. Now, Jesus is going to do all the work. He's going to do all the hard work. You know, he's going to do what's impossible. You know, if it were up to the disciples to multiply that bread and feed that whole big 5,000 person audience, they couldn't do it. You know, likewise, if it's up to us to make our lives acceptable to God, that's just about as hard. We can't do it either. But Jesus doesn't ask you to do it. He doesn't ask you to perform. He doesn't ask for your perfection. Did you notice back in the book of Hebrews that we read, the word perfection or perfect was used? But it didn't use it in the sense of you become perfect. It said the worshipers, those sacrifices could never make the comers thereunto perfect. In other words, the sacrifices make you perfect. The sacrifice of Jesus makes you acceptable. So he's saying, here's what your part is. Torrin, go ahead and put the Amplified up there now. Jesus replied, this is the work, the service that God asks of you, that you believe in the one whom he has sent. And then in the brackets, what the person who created this Amplified version has done is to show you that the Greek word that's translated believe implies the idea of placing your trust in something. Not just to intellectually agree, but to place your trust. That you cleave to, that you trust, that you rely on, that you have faith in his messenger. Well, that's Jesus. In other words, that you place all of your confidence in him. Now, what that implies is not in yourself, but in him. All of our confidence is placed in him, not in us or anything we've done. In fact, we're supposed to forget about us and what we've done, and along with that, the consciousness of sin. Forget about that, and instead trust in him. It's a release from yourself and everything that might make you feel guilty or disqualified, and instead we trust in him. So we don't anymore say, well, like one person said to me one time, I just hope I've done enough good things so I can make it in. I think the reason I keep repeating that and tell you that story all the time is I think so many Christians, that's how they view it. Like I said, like concrete, thoroughly mixed up and well set. It's not, you see, we need to educate our conscience, educate our consciousness, and educate it with the notion that Jesus has done something that, number one, got the job done. Number two, it's eternal and fixed. And number three, he did it, and not you did it. He obtained it. We didn't obtain it. And the work is done, and we've been brought into it, and it's eternal and it's fixed. Now, see, I think this is all really good here in verse 28 and 29. The sole thing that he says when they said, what does God require, is that we believe, that we trust in him, that we choose. It's a choice we make. Now, that's all the background. I said all that so we could skip down a little further in this conversation that Jesus is having. And there's a very interesting thing that he says. Verse 37, if you skip down there, and the reason I'm skipping around is for the sake of time. This is an interesting chapter. It's a fascinating chapter. It's well worth meditating on. But just to cut to the chase, let's go to verse 37. Now, notice what he says here. I think this is really good. He says, all that the Father giveth me shall come to me. All that the Father giveth me shall come to me. And listen, you see, that's talking about a Christian, or a person who places their faith in it, a person who does what he said in the previous verses, who believes in him, who places their faith in him. He's talking about us. He says, everybody that the Father gives me will come to me. And listen to this. Speaking of those who come to him, and him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. Now that's pretty certain and pretty pointed, isn't it? In no wise, that's not how we talk. This is King James translation, 400 years old. Actually, more than 400 and, 1611 is when it was made, so approximately 400 years. I don't say that. I don't say in no wise. Do you? Do you ever say that? Like, no, I will in no wise mow the grass today. I don't say that. Now, if I was hanging out down at the co-op, what I'd say is, ain't no way. That's how we talk at the co-op. Ain't no way. That's what that means. In no wise means ain't no way. Or, more politely, you might say, under no circumstance. Under no circumstance. Under no circumstance will I cast out. He that cometh to me, under no circumstance will I cast out. The Message is really good on this. Torrin, could you give me the Message? Thank you, Torrin, for getting all these translations for me. Listen, every person the Father gives me eventually comes running to me. And once that person is with me, I hold on and I don't let go. How about that? You see, here's the problem. We sometimes conceive of Christianity as something we have entered into. In other words, like it's our grip on God, like we're holding on to God. And if we ever fail in our grip on God, then we're a goner. That's how I kind of used to conceive of it. That's kind of the impression I was given in church, that it's all up to you. But it's not up to you. It's not something you created. He says, everyone that the Father gives me will eventually come running to me, and once that person's with me, I hold on and I don't let go. As you know, on Sunday nights I do a prison service, and sometimes men come walking up to me as I'm crossing the yard to leave. And I can think of at least twice that this has happened. A guy comes up to me and he kind of walks alongside me while I'm leaving, and he says, well, I didn't come to church tonight because, and by the way, you're not required to go, and that's why I always say, you don't have to, it's okay. I'm not. He said, well, I didn't come because I used to be a Christian, but then I backslid. That is an idea that is promoted in churches to create fear in the minds of people, and it's wrong. That's an unscriptural idea. That word, that wording, that expression is not found in the New Testament. Neither is the concept found there. And what I always say when a person says that to me is, you may think that. And what they mean by that is they started off as a Christian, but then things happened, or they made mistakes, or that maybe they had that misconception I had that you're in an exclusive club, and if you make too many mistakes, you're going to get kicked out. And maybe you did something wrong and you feel guilty about it, or maybe you just, things happen, you quit going to church, and you think, well, God has X'd me off the list. Well, what I always tell them when they tell me that is, you may think that, you may think you backslid, but you didn't, because wherever you slid, God slid with you. I know that offends sometimes Christians, so that's why I like to say it real loud and bold. Wherever you slid, God slid with you. Because he says, I hold on and I don't let go. You see, it's not based on your grip on God, it's based on his grip on you. It's not based on your grip on Jesus, it's based on his grip on you. Does he ever reject anybody? No. He says under no circumstances. He says, once that person's with me, I hold on and I don't let go. Now, that's in his mind. But see, you can have, it might not be in your mind, but it needs to be. It should be, see. It should be in your mind. One of those men that used to be at BJCC called me on the phone one time after he'd been released, and like 2 or 3 years after he'd been released, and he said, I'm living in Oklahoma City right now, and he told me about the job he got and how he'd been promoted on his job because he went to work every day, and said, I thought that's what a Christian is supposed to do, just go to work every day. And the manager said, well, nobody else does. And so he promoted him. Well, that's what he said. He promoted him. He made him manager of the restaurant. And I said, well, good for you. Thank you for calling to tell me that. He said, no, but that's not why I called. I thought that's why he called, just to tell me how good things had turned out. But he said, I want to know if you know of any churches in Oklahoma City. And I said, you got to be kidding me. The size of Oklahoma City, there's churches on every corner. Oklahoma City is probably second only to Tulsa in terms of how many churches there are. It's like the holy city of Jerusalem, it's like that's how Tulsa is, and Oklahoma City's right up. I mean, there's churches everywhere. He said, well, I've been trying all these different churches, and I went to this one, and I really liked the music, and I was liking it pretty well, except then the pastor said, I'm starting a series on sin, and every week he talks about a different sin. And he says, now I'm so depressed I don't want to go back anymore. And I said, I agree with you. That's depressing. You're not supposed to go to church and then leave feeling worse. You're not supposed to hear about sin. You're not supposed to talk about it. You're not supposed to have a consciousness of it. You're not supposed to be thinking about it. Because the worshipers, once purged, should have no more awareness of sins, no more consciousness of sins. Remember, I told you that the Greek word translated conscience or consciousness, it means a shared awareness. God doesn't have any awareness of it. What his awareness is, Jesus already put it away. And we're supposed to share that with him. Now, one more, let me do a couple more, then I'm done. Okay. Briefly, John chapter 5, that was chapter 6, that was really good. Torrin, I'm going back to the King James translation. This is John chapter 5, verse 24. By the way, I think these are all very positive passages of Scripture that you should factor into your thinking. I like a translation I read, or maybe it was a commentator, talking about a passage in Romans where he talked about, Paul says, reckon this to be true. He said it's like put it down in the accounting book. Reckon means write it in your mind, in the account book of your mind. Write this down. Account this to be true. Put it in the account book. So these are all passages you should put into the account book. Reckon them to be so. This is John chapter 5, verse 24. Jesus says, verily, verily. By the way, when he says verily, verily, he's like getting up the highlighter, and he's saying, you better pay attention to this because I'm telling you something really important here. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that heareth my word and believeth on him that sent me. By the way, there again, he says, this is the only thing you're supposed to do. This is the only requirement. This is the only thing God wants out of you, just to respond. This is a human response. Just respond by agreeing, by believing, by embracing. That's the only thing he wants from you. It's not your performance, it's your confidence, that you transfer your confidence from yourself to him. You embrace what it is he says to you in this Bible here. That he that heareth my word and believeth, or placed their confidence in him that sent me, first of all, he says, hath everlasting life. Now you remember what we read earlier, that Jesus obtained for us eternal redemption. Everlasting means the same thing as eternal. It means it's fixed. It means it can't be changed. It can't be undone. In reality, I think a lot of Christians don't really believe in eternal redemption. They believe in intermittent redemption. But he didn't say intermittent. He said eternal. That means it's fixed. It never gets undone. And notice, all he said is that the person who hears and believes, that now they've done this, and now here's what you have. Everlasting life. Well, you could stop right there and say, okay, good enough. That's a great message. That makes me happy. No, but wait, there's more, like a TV commercial. Wait, he's not done yet. Number 2, he says, and shall not come into condemnation. That word condemnation is a Greek word krisis, which sometimes is translated judgment. Will not come into judgment. Why? There's nothing to be judged because Jesus is going to take away sins. At this point, he hasn't yet. He did for us. Will not come into judgment. So he can say, wow, that was great. That's good news. Wait, there's more. Just like a TV commercial. But listen to this last one. Has passed from death into life. Get that. Has passed from death to life. That's an interesting expression, isn't it? Has passed from death to life. Now, hold that in your mind for a moment and turn over to chapter 11 of John. And maybe that will help you understand something that might seem perplexing that Jesus said. And I'm going to start reading with verse 20. John chapter 11, verse 20. Here's the context. In chapter 11, we're told that Jesus had a friend named Lazarus who had two sisters, Mary and Martha. And Lazarus, they sent word and said, Lazarus is sick. And Jesus just waited and hung out where he was for a couple of days. And then finally, after a couple of days passed, he said to the disciples, let's go to Lazarus and wake him up because he's sleeping. And the disciples said, well, if he's sleeping, that's good for him. He said, no, you don't understand, he's dead. So here Jesus arrives on the scene where Lazarus has died, and Martha comes to him in verse 20. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him. But Mary was still in the house. And then Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. In a way, she's kind of shaming him a little bit. Said, if he'd come a little sooner, he wouldn't have died. Verse 22. But I know, even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask God, God will give it thee. See, she's got a lot of faith in him. He says, even now, whatever you say, that's the way it is. Whatever you ask God, I know from experience, you've got a tight connection here. Whatever you ask of God, he'll give it to you. Verse 23 said, Jesus said to her, thy brother shall rise again. Verse 24, Martha said to him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So she's saying, yes, sure, at the end of time, the great resurrection at the end, yes, he'll rise then. Verse 25, Jesus has something else in mind. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Now listen to this. He that believeth in me, you remember what we read back in John chapter 5. He said, whoever hears my word and believes on him that sent me has everlasting life and will not come into condemnation or judgment, but has passed from death to life. Now he says, he that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. In verse 26, listen to this. Whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? Now, many people stumble over this verse and say, well, how can that be? Because every Christian that's lived from the days of Jesus until now has died. But he says here, whoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? Well, what you must do is you're forced to say Jesus views death in a different way than we ordinarily view death. We think of death purely in a physical sense. Remember, the very first thing we said today is we made a contrast. Jesus came to replace the physical with the spiritual. He got rid of the physical temple, the physical animal sacrifices, and replaced it with the spiritual temple, the spiritual sacrifice of himself. He's speaking here spiritually. He's speaking here the same way that he was speaking in John chapter 5, verse 24, when he said, whoever believeth in me has everlasting life, will never come into condemnation, has already passed from death to life in a spiritual sense. What Paul calls dead in trespasses and sins. He's passed out of that condition into a condition of life, a shared life with Jesus, with God. And in that condition, that's what he means here when he says, whoever lives and believes in me, John 5:24 said, has passed from death to life, shall never die. You know what he's saying is, you can't go back. You can't go back. You can't go back. Did you know that Noah's Ark is a good example of this? God told Noah, build an ark, and a great flood is coming. And the flood was a judgment on sin. It says that right in the text. So build an ark and get your family, get the animals, and get them all on the ark. And we know this story. Everybody's heard this story. You know this. And so they got on the ark. And by the way, it says God shut the door. If you read it carefully, it says God shut them in. That's interesting. That's so they couldn't fall out. But listen to this. the rain came and the flood came and flooded the earth, and the ark went through the flood. You could say the judgment. It already took place. And where it came out, when the flood was gone, when the judgment was over, the judgment was passed, the ark came to rest and opened the door, and it was in a new world. You might say a new creation. Now, lots of things could happen with Noah. Noah made some mistakes, after that. And a lot of things can happen, but they couldn't go back. They couldn't go back to that old world. There was no way to go back. They had, in a sense, passed from death to life. They were in a new world, a new creation, no way back. Can't go back. It's just impossible. Impossible. Even though lots of things can happen, the children of Israel, this is another example, they were in bondage in Egypt, and so God sent a deliverer, and you all know this story, of course. His name is Moses. And Moses delivered the people, and the final plague was the death of the firstborn. And they took the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorpost of their house, again, full of a lot of symbolism there. And that was the final plague that convinced Pharaoh to let them go. And so the children of Israel, under the leadership of Moses, they left Egypt, left their bondage, and they came to the Red Sea. And now they're stuck because I can't get across the Red Sea. And Pharaoh changed his mind and said, what was I thinking? Let all my slaves go. And he sent his army after them, and they were going to recapture all of them, and they're in trouble. Pharaoh's coming on this side, and the Red Sea's on that side, and there's nowhere to go. So God told Moses, stretch out your rod. And if you've ever seen it in the movie with Charlton Heston, it's really dramatic, He stretches out his rod, and sea parts, and they go across on dry land, and triumphant music, the music swells up, and they're looking at the water, and they pass, and it's all great. And they come out on the other side, and then Pharaoh comes and rides his chariots down there to follow him, and the waters close on them and swallow up Pharaoh's army, and all the horses and the men drown and everything. So now they're saved from their enemy, and they're on the other side of the Red Sea. Now, if you go on reading in the story, it's very dramatic in the movie, of course, but if you go on reading in the Bible, it says that on their way to the Promised Land, God had a Promised Land, a land of promise for them, and it wasn't all that far, but the people got discouraged. You never heard of anyone getting discouraged, I'm sure, but they got discouraged. And they even said, you can read this in the text, they even said to themselves, I wish we were back in Egypt. And if we could, we'd go back. And in Egypt we have this and we have that. And here there's no food and there's no water, and we're very discouraged. But even though they got discouraged, and even though they did some things wrong, God did a miracle to get them out. He opened the Red Sea. And that's how they got out. And then the Red Sea closed. And even though they got discouraged, and even though they might have backslid, quote, quote, they couldn't. They couldn't, because a miracle, an act of God, got them out, and there's no way to go back. They couldn't go back. Even though lots of things can happen, they made some mistakes, they did a lot of things wrong. Just like all Christians, there isn't a Christian alive who hadn't made mistakes, done things wrong after becoming a Christian. But there's no way back. You've already passed over. Jesus said, he that liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Now, finally, why does this matter? Well, go back to Hebrews again, chapter 9, Torin. Hebrews chapter 9. Let's read what we read earlier and then read the following verse. I didn't read the next verse, and I wanted to leave this with you. This is Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 12. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered once into the holy place. It says, having, meaning it's already done, having obtained eternal redemption for us. In other words, something fixed that can't be undone. That's what eternal means. Redemption, you remember what I told you what that word means? It means the release from the debt, or the release from obligation, or the release by paying a ransom or a sum. His sacrifice paid the sum. It's eternal. It can't be undone. He obtained it for us. Verse 13 going on. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean, meaning in the Old Testament, sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh. In other words, if that's what they did in the Old Testament, verse 4 says, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. In other words, think of it this way, the writer is saying. Think of it this way. If what they did in the Old Testament was ritual purifying, how much more does the reality? Listen, here's what it should do. It should purge your consciousness, your awareness. Clean your awareness up. He's writing so that you would clean your awareness, your conscience, your consciousness from dead works, meaning works that are no longer have any efficacy. We could say sins. So why? So you got a clean conscience, so you're not worried about dragging a bunch of baggage along, so you know God's not mad at you. And now you can, with a clear conscience, serve God and do the right thing with no fear, with no worry, with no concern, serve the living God. In other words, the point of it all is factor this into your thinking. Think of it this way. And that makes you free to live a straightforward life serving God with a clear conscience. Okay, I think that's all we got. But wait, there is one more thing. Go ahead, Torrin, you can turn it off. And everybody